Welcome to All Right in Sin City, a podcast about writers and writing in the Windsor-Detroit region. Your podcasters today are
Irene Moore Davis, author, educator, and local historian.
Sarah Jarvis, former bookseller, publishing rep, and literary festival chair.
and me, Kim Conklin, Windsor-based writer and filmmaker.
Our featured guest today is Lainey Cameron. Lainey Cameron is a debut author who has achieved great success with her novel, The Exit Strategy. It's the winner of the 2020 Reader's Favorite Award for Women's Fiction and #1 Amazon bestseller in feminist books. The book has also been honored with a gold medal in the 2020 Reader's Choice Awards for Women's Fiction, a finalist designation in the 2020 Best Book Awards by American Bookfest, a nomination as a notable indie for 2020 by Shelf Unbound, and it was longlisted for Chanticleer Somerset Book Awards. The story was inspired by Cameron's decade of being the only woman in the corporate boardroom. It tells the story of a Silicon Valley investor who first meets her husband's mistress across the negotiating table. Cameron was introduced to us by the folks at the Detroit Writing Room. And she also hosts a podcast, The Best of Women's Fiction. A digital nomad, she picks locations around the world to live, write, and host her podcast for months at a time. Originally from Scotland, she admits to a soft spot for men in kilts and good malt whiskey. Welcome, Lainey.
Hi, I love the podcast, so I'm so excited to be here with you.
Great. What can you tell us about your life as a digital nomad? How and why did you start that way of life?
Well, it's directly related to my writing career. I actually started 5 years ago when I decided to become an author. And, you know, living as an author is not so good from a money perspective. And so my husband and I were in San Francisco at the time, and we realized that there was really no need for us to be paying expensive San Francisco rent if both of us could now do our jobs remotely. He's a computer consultant and he does some chief operating officer work. And so he can do that remotely. And there's really no reason I have to be in any particular place to write. And so 5 years ago, we decided to just pick inexpensive places around the world, 6 months at a time, which is generally as long as you can get a visa when you're going outside of the US. And we've since then, in 5 years, we actually lived in an RV for 6 months, discovered that's a terrible idea for writing. I'm happy to share why, but we've lived in Cartagena, Colombia for the last year now. We've been in Mexico, we've lived in France. We're so blessed that in this world where all you need is an internet connection, that I can still be connected to the writer community and the author community and do all of the things that I do, but it doesn't really matter where I am.
Very cool. Can you tell us a little bit about your background in Silicon Valley before you ran away from all of that, and how you decided to leave that world to become a novelist?
Yeah, I've been in Silicon Valley, or when I left 5 years ago, I'd been in Silicon Valley for 20 years. I'm originally Scottish, but I actually studied French and business in college and got transferred from France, where I was working, to Silicon Valley in my 20s. And then for 20 years, I worked in very big companies and startups. And by the end of my career, the last 10 years, I was a senior executive in charge of marketing for both big and small companies. And very often I was the only woman in the boardroom. And that experience of what it feels like to be constantly justifying your capability, constantly making the case for why you deserve to be the one person in the room who doesn't look like everybody else in the room. And I know many people from all kinds of groups can relate to that feeling. But I really wanted to write a book which kind of was set in Silicon Valley, but my goal was to show what that feels like, to be the only woman in the room, to be that person who's trying to kind of stand up for all womankind when all you want to do is do the right thing in this meeting today for your job. And so I felt like that was an important thing to try and share.
The title of your book is The Exit Strategy, and there seem to be several characters who are looking for an exit from a relationship. How did you view that title when you first came up with that? How did you see it fitting into the story?
So it's kind of got three meanings in the book. So first off, the exit strategy is a very common Silicon Valley term. It's about how an investor gets out of an investment. And so, for example, if a venture capitalist, which is what Rin, my main character is, invests in a startup, an exit strategy could be that you sell the company. It could be that the company goes public. It could be that the company goes under. Whatever happens, that's your exit strategy. It's the day you get to walk away from the investment, hopefully having made some cash out of it as a venture capitalist. But as you say in this book, the story is that Rin, who is a venture capitalist, has just invested in the company of Carly, who she learns on the first pages of the book is her husband's mistress. And so the two of them are thrust into this situation where they're basically forced to work together because one has bet their career on this company, Rin, and the other can't afford to lose her startup's funding, Carly, otherwise her startup will go under. And so the question at the beginning of the book is, how the heck are these two women going to get out of this situation, or at least work through it? And then ultimately, it's got a third meaning later in the book, which is about Rin realizing that she's worked so hard her whole life to kind of belong to this boys' club in Silicon Valley. And maybe she was asking the wrong question all along.
Very interesting. The exit strategy seems to swim against the current in the world of women's fiction. In this book, the two main characters, Rin and Carly, are working together as they try to get the same man out of their lives instead of competing for him. Why did you choose women's fiction as the genre for your story?
It's a great question. Part of it is there are so many stereotypes of, well, let's take, for example, the situation of a wife and a mistress, right? The reason the book has a lot of tension at the beginning is because as women, we all read it and go, whoa, this is never going to work out. They're going to tear each other to bits. And so I wanted to write a book that shared my life experience, which is that women don't tear each other to bits. They lift each other up, even in awkward, difficult situations. And to be honest, I'm kind of sick of seeing, especially on screen, that we're going to portray those professional women to kind of be, I don't know if I can use the B word on this podcast, but to be very aggressive towards each other and to not be collaborative. And that drives me crazy. That's not my experience. In my experience, women are smarter and better than that. Yeah, it can happen. Yeah, teenage girls can be pretty challenging. But my experience of grown-up women is that we actually know how to support each other. And I wanted to put that into a book. Now, what's interesting is I'm so thrilled the book has done so well because it actually came out through a small publisher. And the reason it came out through a small publisher is when I took this book to agents, all of them looked at it and said, we're not sure there's a market for a book like that. Like, can't you change it to make it a revenge novel? Can't you change it to make it a thriller where the women kind of go after each other? And I was very firm in my no, heck no, that's not the book I set out to write. And if I have to take it a different path to get it into the hands of readers, I will. But I did hear a lot of feedback. I think I had 135 agent rejections, and they were all very similar. They were all saying, great book, page turner. I stayed up all night to finish it, but I have no idea how to sell this. Why would anyone buy a book about women helping each other out?
Well, the novel does open up with a startling scene as Rin discovers her husband's betrayal, and the pace never really lets up. So what do you think the fast pace of the novel contributes to the story?
I really wanted to write a page turner. That was one of my goals. And it's funny, one of the things I've learned is that the stuff you work on that you think is bad in a book, at least for me with this debut, ends up being the very thing that people congratulate you and compliment you on. So I had to work like for a year with a developmental editor. We rewrote in the last year before the book came out, I rewrote with her insight the book 3 times. And the main focus was actually on pacing and character development, but mostly pacing because I kind of wanted to skip the piece in the middle where the two women become friends. I'm not giving anything away by telling you in the book that ultimately this is a friendship story. And I kind of wanted to skip it because I felt like it was going to be hard to make that page turning. Like, what's interesting about watching two people gradually become friends? And so I had to really, really work at that piece to keep the pace going so that you're constantly asking like, oh, wait, no, that's going to get in the way. Oh, wait, this is never going to work out. And so I love the fact that like that was actually the hardest thing for me with this book because the premise doesn't lend itself really easily to being a page turner, right? And so originally I would like skip entire chunks. Like I would go from like, they have dinner and now they're best friends. And my developmental editor would say, no, you can't skip the 10 chapters in the middle. You just have to work out how to make them interesting. And so I love when people say, like you just said, that it's a page turner because I'm like, yes, I worked at that. That was actually hard work.
Yes, it was a page turner, definitely. So you've talked about many of the scenes of the novel, like the Cougar Night scene, as being inspired by real experiences in the Silicon Valley. But what about the main plot and characters? Are Rin and Carly inspired by real women that you saw go through this kind of thing?
They're kind of we first off, I'll say all fiction is inspired at some level from real life, right? We draw on our life experiences to come up with our imagined ideas for fiction. So for sure, I'm divorced, I'll tell you that. So going through a divorce is painful. So certainly some of that poured into this book. But also the sexist environment absolutely came from my personal experience, right? People ask me if I set out to write like a feminist anthem of a book, which is what it's been called. And the funny thing is I didn't. I set out to write a friendship story about a wife and a mistress. And when I had to work out where to set it, obviously I just went to what I knew, which is Silicon Valley. And the sexism was just part of my experience. And so it literally just became a case of setting it in things that I knew really well. So like, I was like, where could I put a scene that's interesting? Oh, let's use Cougar Night. That's a real thing where I've had a business meeting or tried to have a business meeting in the middle of this thing called Cougar Night, which I'll explain for those who haven't read the book. And you are welcome to Google it. If you Google Cougar Night Silicon Valley, it will bring up the actual name of the hotel where this happened until recently. I changed the name of the hotel in the book just for like, let's make sure I don't get sued. Even though it's a real thing, I'm like, I don't want to go there. It's the only location in the book where I changed the name of the location. Everything else is real. I actually put a little guide on my website where you can see where all the places are. But Cougar Night's a real thing where it's not just about women of a certain age. It's actually all the venture capitalists who are kind of rolling in dough, men, unfortunately, are there to be hit on, to literally have women come up to them and try and approach them and try and kind of snag their, I guess outside of Silicon Valley, you might call it a sugar daddy, but it's not really, because the women who are there themselves are professional women. So it's just a fascinating thing. It grossed me out every time I ended up there. And it's horrible to think that you could be trying to be a professional, having a regular conversation while everybody's getting hit on all around you, and that's just normal. It just seemed like a good place to take a scene and set it.
Let's talk about Todd for a minute now. He's kind of a monster worthy of a true crime TV show. I mean, he's a big, big criminal. So why did you choose to make his character this big? Was it to drive the plot or something else?
It was to drive the plot a little. And it was also a case of, they say, take your character and chase them up a tree and then throw rocks at them, is the famous writing thing that we say about what you should do to your characters. And I didn't want to make it easy for Rin to escape from her marriage. I won't give away what happens exactly, but this is not a regular divorce. She discovers a lot of things about her husband that she did not know that are much bigger than just he was having an affair. And so I didn't want to make it too easy on her. I really wanted to torture her a little in terms of making it hard for her to get out of the relationship. And one of the upsides of that is that it also kind of contributes to why she and Carly are able to bond and able to become friends.
Rin seems to have the most dramatic character arc in the book. At first, she's so angry that it's almost hard to like her, another very unusual choice in women's fiction. What inspired you to follow that development path for her?
And that's actually why I had to work on character when I said a second ago that I had to work on character for a year. Initially, people did not like Rin. My beta readers were like, I don't want to read a book about this woman. She's not relatable. I don't like her at all. And it was really interesting that part of it was we put some lens on how we think about professional women that is different to our lens on women in general. And so by making her a professional woman, I'll give you an example. One of the feedback I got from my beta readers early in the process, there was a moment in the book, I think it was the scene where she first meets Carly across the board table, which is a pretty dramatic scene at the beginning of the book. And my beta readers were saying, I don't understand why she isn't crying. Why is she not crying right now in this meeting? And for me, having lived in Silicon Valley and being the only woman in the boardroom, that is so out of the sphere of possibility. It doesn't matter what happens. You can never cry. But it made me realize I had to learn that my readers don't come from my background. And I can't just assume that people know these things. And many of my beta readers were like, well, for her to react in that way, she just must be a horrible person and a harsh person. And so one of the main things I had to do was slip in backstory very carefully throughout the book to explain why she is the way she is, so that the reader could understand that she has had to fight for, tooth and nail for every position she's had. She's had to prove herself at every moment. And so, yeah, she's got a little bit of a hard edge at this point, but it's a survival mechanism. You actually have to become like that in order to survive in these environments. And so it was a challenge to make her relatable, but just like the challenge of, I didn't want to make this into a revenge novel. A lot of agents told me, well, can't you just make the story more about getting revenge on the husband? And it's about escaping the husband, but it's not necessarily a revenge novel. Like very often when you see movies with a wife and a mistress, if they do become friends, it's because they're going to take the guy down together. So I think of a movie like The Other Woman. And like when they do become friends, which I would say is like 1 in 20 movies that have a wife and a mistress, even they become friends at all. 19 out of 20, they hate each other and they go after each other. The 1 in 20 where they become friends, it's about going after the guy and teaming up to get revenge. And here's the thing, that makes the book about the man. It puts him in the center and it makes the story about him. And I was determined that this book would be about 2 professional women and how to make them relatable to the reader, not about Todd. Like Todd is the plot puppet, if you want, but he's not who the book's about.
In the novel, there are also several instances of sexual harassment in the workplace that are revealed. And the women do join together to create a movement to stop it. What kind of action do you think would have had a real impact on preventing sexual harassment in Silicon Valley?
This is such a big question because in the book, I'm a little blunt-edged with it. And what I mean by that, I use the obvious stuff for the sexual harassment. I talk about younger women in the office and being fussed and having bosses say incredibly sexist things. And all of these things have happened. But I think what worries me that it's much harder to solve is the insidious stuff, is where you don't get the opportunity, but you never hear that it's because you didn't meet the model of how you display anger, for example. It's very hard for women in Silicon Valley to display anger, right? If you're a man and something really bad happens, you can slam your hand on the table and say, unacceptable. If you're a woman and you do exactly the same thing, you are emotional, you are hysterical. But on the other hand, if you don't display emotion, you're viewed as not being totally passionate and into the situation. So sometimes you get into these lose-lose where it's like you can't display the same emotion as a man. Interestingly, like it's okay to show emotion as a man. I've worked with many male bosses in sales who screamed at the sales team. And I literally mean not shouted, screamed. Now, can you imagine a woman like standing on a chair and screaming at the sales team because they're about to lose their numbers, the day before the end of the quarter? Can you imagine how that would be taken? And so I tried to do something in the book where we create a movement to give women friends in the business, to give them a person to go to give them someone they can talk to be believed. And there are many initiatives like this that are out there now, and we're seeing more, but I think tech is still really far behind some of the other industries because tech wants to believe it's enlightened and wants to believe that this stuff doesn't happen anymore. And so it's kind of like, if you don't accept you've got a problem, you can't fix it. And so I look at, like, for example, the gaming industry, and that is an industry where women are still being treated incredibly difficult. Just they're being bullied, they're being harassed online. Or you even look at like what's happening today with political commentators going after journalists. And, they don't go after male journalists and like put out their information on the internet and have them harassed. They go after female journalists. That's not like by accident that happens that way. It really, gosh, I wish I could give you one silver bullet and fix this, because believe me, that's what I go be doing right now.
Do you see any area that has a hint of that silver bullet?
I love what Reese Witherspoon is doing in Hollywood. I love, if you look at her production, first off, she's the most amazing book reviewer, right? She's a big supporter of authors. Reese's Book Club does a fabulous job of lifting up women writers and women's fiction. But if you look at what she's doing with Hello Sunshine, which is her production company, she's picking up a lot of fabulous books, a lot of them women's fiction, with complex female characters. It's what we used to call unlikable female characters. And I think we've moved away from that term because I think we use unlikable to mean flawed, right? You can have a flawed male character and you don't describe him as an unlikable man. You have a flawed female character and we like to apply this unlikable label. And so I love what she's doing, where she's taking these incredibly complex characters and she's letting women play roles that are not like the stereotype that is either all good or all bad, right? Not the angel or the devil, or not, you know, the virgin or the devil stereotypes. And so I love how she's doing that. And so I think there are a lot of sparks of hope, people who are doing things like that. And you think about it, like 15 years ago, Reese Witherspoon was an actress, and people would have said like, well, what power do you have as an actress? But look at what she did. She created a production company, and now she's a power broker. And that's amazing to see.
And some of her recent TV series on streaming services have had some very complex female characters. They've been really interesting. So yeah, I hear what you're saying. So now how would you describe contemporary women's fiction as a genre? How is it different of the traditional romance novels of the past?
So I'm really involved with an association called the Women's Fiction Writers Association, an association that has about 1,500 writers of women's fiction, and their definition of the genre is that the main character has to go through an emotional journey over the course of the book. And so in their definition, romance or pure romance genre fiction wouldn't actually fit necessarily, because the emotional journey is not a purely romantic emotional journey of falling in love. That would be genre romance. And I think that definition has a lot of scope for different types of books, right? So we've saw historically in the contemporary genre of women's fiction, we've seen a lot of woman leaves her husband, goes to the countryside, opens a bed and breakfast, rebuilds her life, kind of, or a beach, a bed and breakfast or a beach, one or the other. And there's nothing wrong with those books. Those books are fabulous. But we're seeing more diversity now. We're seeing diversity in terms of ethnic backgrounds of who's writing women's fiction. I think if you look like 5 years ago, women's fiction was really lacking in like women's fiction, pure genre women's fiction, or at least maybe there were and I didn't see them and they weren't getting, I always am careful because maybe they were there and I didn't see them because they weren't getting the visibility that they deserved. But now you're seeing all these really interesting voices coming out. So like The Kindest Lie by Nancy Johnson, fabulous book that just came out in February. And that's in the women's fiction genre, but it's an emotional journey that the main character, Ruth, goes through. She left her baby when she was a teenager, and she goes back home to her hometown to find her baby and to kind of re-up and rethink about whether she wants to be a mother going forwards. And it's absolutely an emotional journey, but it's a story that wasn't really being told before. And so I love that we're seeing more diversity in terms of backgrounds. We're seeing more diversity in terms of types of stories like this that's set in the workplace, which isn't historically what you would see in the women's fiction genre. So I love that. Like, to me, that's fabulous. I'd like to see more voices. I'd like to see more diversity in the voices. My friend Lynn Liao Butler, her book is coming out, and it's about a woman who goes back in July. It's about a woman who goes back to Taiwan and re-embraces her family in Taiwan after she inherits. So I like that we're seeing more stories that expand from that core of like rebuilding your life after heartache. I feel like there's still so many more stories to be told.
What kind of stories would you like to see? I mean, more diversity certainly is a great thing, but what other kinds of things or evolutions would you like to see in the genre?
I'd like to see more professional women stories that aren't thrillers. Like, it's interesting when you get into the environment of like a law firm or Silicon Valley, very often it's a thriller. Like there's many more thrillers like that, relatively few women's fiction. Personally, I love books that take me into a different culture. So like one of my favorite books last year was a book called A Door Between Us by Esaneh Sadir. And that's actually set in Iran. And it's the story of someone who's about to get married right before the revolution in 2009. I think I got the year right, the Green Wave. And what happens is the husband and the wife's family end up on two different sides politically during a cultural revolution. And so they're not able to be together, and the families are basically at war, but it's told through the lens of a woman who just wanted to marry the man she loves. And she's caught in the middle of all of this politics. And, you know, for me today, living in a world that has become incredibly divisive sometimes in the US, I could really relate to that concept of like, what if your domestic life, right, that you want to be married, you want to be with the man you love, conflicts with the political climate of the world you're living in and puts your children and your family at risk. You pursuing what you want is going to put everybody at risk. And how do you know when to step up and to be part of the political movement and when to step back and protect your loved ones? And so like, I love books that raise really big questions like that. There's another one from last year called Daughters of Smoke and Fire by Eva Homa. And that's set in Kurdistan. It's a Kurdish heroine. And again, like, I'm probably never going to go to Kurdistan area of the world, but experiencing what it's like to be Kurdish, to feel like you've been persecuted, to make decisions based on that, to lose hope at various points. That's something that I just love, that fiction can take you into a world and a culture you're not from, and it helps you develop empathy for people who are not from your background. So like, those are the books I love. Those are the ones I want to see more and more of.
We actually talked to Ava last year on this podcast. So yeah, we are very familiar with that book.
Yes, and a graduate of the University of Windsor as well. Yes. So your book has gathered quite a following. How did you go about building your community and getting the word out to potential readers? Did you rely on social media, reviewers, traditional public relations? How did you go about that?
I did not have a publicist. Being with a small press, I actually didn't really have the time frame that would allow for a publicist. There's a little bit of a misconception about this in the world, that I only had like a cover and a final title, I think like 60 days before the book came out. And to have a publicist, you need like 6 months runway to really have any value out of having a publicist, because they're going to have arcs. They're going to take those paper advanced review copies. They're going to give them to reviewers. Well, I didn't even have a paper copy until the day my book came out. It was the first time I actually put my hands on a paper copy. And so I had to work a little bit around that. And so I focused on first the writer community, because I've met so many amazing authors along the way, and authors are so supportive. And so I reached out to many of the authors that I admired and said, would you mind reading this and just giving your honest opinion to the world? And so that was how it started getting out there, because authors that I really admire, like Carrie Lunsdale, who's a big bestseller, for example, she read it and she gave it a blurb, but she also shared it with her fans who follow her. And then from there, I'm really into Instagram. I love sharing on Instagram. Because I'm a digital nomad, I have a lot of really cool stuff to share. Now, obviously, the pandemic's different. I'm not taking COVID around the world. I'm stuck in one place like everybody else. But in normal times, I have these great things to share. I have these cultural insights. Every time I go to a place and I learn something that's fascinating to me, I'll share that on Instagram and say, did you know, I'll give you one example for this week. Did you know that the Mexicans, which is where I am right now in Mexico, love the Irish? It's St. Patrick's Day coming up this weekend, coming up soon here. And our church here in San Miguel is lit up in green. In the middle of Mexico in the mountains, our church is lit up in green for St. Patrick's Day. Well, it's because there's a history that there was an Irish battalion that fought in the war against the United States in the Mexican-American War. And ever since, the Mexicans have felt in debt to the Irish, and they love the Irish. But these kind of little quirky historical things, quirky cultural things that you would never imagine that St. Patrick's Day is being, celebrated in a weird town, a beautiful town in Mexico. I love sharing that stuff on Instagram. And so I think that's how I've built connections with readers also, is just sharing a little bit of the insight of how grateful I am to have this life of being able to see different places in the world.
When you sat down to write this book, what did you want women to take away from your story? And what are readers telling you about the book now?
I'm getting a lot of letters, like a few emails from people who relate to having been in a male environment, and very different ones, whether it's shipbuilding or like optical engineering, all kinds of different fields. I'm finding people write to me and say, like, it's so cool to read a book which is about being the only woman in the room. That's been my experience my whole career. And so that's one thing that's really neat. That's been I guess unexpected. I didn't see that coming. It's lovely. Every time I get one of those emails, I'm like, oh, this is so cool. This makes me happy. I just wanted to make a difference in one reader's life. Someone actually asked me this when I was going through rejection, when I was going through that phase of like 130 plus agents telling me they didn't think there was a market for this book. And I had to make some decisions. In that case, are you going to put it in a drawer? Are you going to self-publish? Are you going to go with a small publisher? And a very good writer friend, Allison Hammer, said, well, what really matters to you? What are you in this for? And I said, if one person reads this book and feels like it made a difference in their life, that's enough. I don't need this to be a New York Times bestseller. This is just the beginning of my author career. If it gets out there and one person feels like it made a difference to them, that's going to be enough. And so I'm thrilled because I feel like I made that benchmark, and it was a reasonable benchmark to set myself as a first-time author.
You're also a podcaster like we are. What are you talking with other women, writers of women's fiction about in your podcast? What kind of new trends are you seeing?
So I'm talking about women's fiction. So it's all writers. It's called The Best of Women's Fiction, and it's all writers of women's fiction. And I'm asking them in each podcast episode where their inspiration came from. I'm always fascinated by this concept of the initial spark that creates a book. is very often not the end book that you end up with. Books go through tons of revision. And so I asked them, like, where did the idea come from for this particular book? And that's a fun question when you can ask someone like, for example, Barbara O'Neill, who's sold like, I think 2 million copies of When We Believed in Mermaids. She's had all these big sellers, millions and millions of copies. And she's had like, I don't know, like 8+ bestsellers. And I love when I can ask someone like that, how do you keep finding those ideas? Like after that many big books, how do you keep finding them? And she shares, you know, here's the little grain of insight that it starts with, and here's how I keep the ideas coming. And so I always ask, where did the initial idea for this book come from? I ask how it changed during editing. As a writer, I'm fascinated with how the initial idea can end up somewhere very different. And so I ask how it changed. And I always ask what they're reading. I find it really fun to hear what writers are reading. And so I ask the authors what they're reading and any advice they have for other writers.
And what do you like about podcasting that's different from writing?
I love the community. For me, I have a phrase in my bio that says, for me, community makes the author's life worthwhile. Like community is what makes it possible to keep doing this, because you have ups and downs, right? You have great moments and you have very low moments. And that's just part of the creative life and part of being an author or a writer. And so the community is what makes it worthwhile. You know, every time I do one of these podcasts, we try to keep the episodes short, like 15 minutes, but I always end up talking to the author before and after. Generally before, I'm telling them, don't worry, it's not live, it's easy, don't worry. And after, we're chatting about like how their life is going in general. I get such great insights and support, and I don't feel like I'm alone. I do not feel like when I can't find the words or I'm struggling with something, there are so many people there to help. And I feel like I'm part of a much bigger community than myself. And so that's it for me. This is part of being part of a bigger community and giving back.
So what's your next project? What are you working on now?
Well, we talked earlier about fiction is inspired from real life, and I'm a digital nomad. So my next project is about a digital nomad. It's about a digital nomad adventure travel Instagrammer. So imagine those people you see in the crazy photos where they're like hanging off the edge of a cliff by their fingernails, or they're jumping off with little flying suits. So that is this character. That is what she does, but she's actually living under a new identity. She changed her name. She left college. She changed her name. She left the US and she became accidentally famous. So now she's this Instagrammer with all of these followers. But at the beginning of the book, something happens that puts her original childhood trauma back in the news. And she's going to be forced to make a decision on whether she's willing to embrace who she used to be or not.
We'd love to hear a little bit of your work. Would you like to read from Exit Strategy for our listeners?
Sure. I think I'll read the beginning. I went back and forth. There's some funny bits around sexism, but I think probably the best way to get a tone of the book is to start with the first pages. And actually, you know what? I'll read you something before the first page, which is I'll read you the dedication, because it actually captures some of the tone of the book. The dedication is to my mother, to my mom, and it says, "Thanks for teaching me that women don't need to fear their strength or minimize their voice, and can be badass resilient, smart, caring, and open-hearted. Everything I've needed to know in this life." So that's the dedication, which kind of sets the tone for the book. And then I'll just read you the first page. Rin scrawled "seething" on a scrap of paper and crammed it into the feelings jar on her desk. She winced at the glare bouncing off the adjacent skyscrapers, streaming through the wall of windows into her office. The San Francisco weather gods apparently didn't get the memo. Dismal fog was the appropriate backdrop to discovering her husband's affair, not sparkly dam sunshine. She opened her valuation spreadsheet. Perhaps a focus on the data would calm the shitstorm rumbling inside her head. Pop's technique of stuffing unwanted emotions in a jar usually worked, but not this morning. And the meeting with BioLarge started in 10 minutes. The promotion she'd been denied for 2 years depended on closing this deal. She refused to blow it because of an infidelity brain scramble. The rows of numbers blurred, and she struggled to recall her negotiation points as dozens of memories demanded re-examination. Todd's golf trip last month? With her, his mistress. 2 weeks ago, when his apartment development project required an extended stay in Nevada through the weekend? With her. Those loving texts when Rin was out of town? I can't manage one more hour without you. What time do you land? Not so loving now, just measuring how much longer he had with her. She didn't know which hurt more, Todd lying or him finding this other woman, this Carly, so special she was worth risking a perfect partnership. Rin stood and shook out her hands. If more time remained, she'd redo her analysis, but her brain had been buzzing like this since yesterday. Thousands of micro-deceptions like memory popcorn, every burst a new realization of betrayal.
Thank you very much. That was awesome. And thank you so much for joining us today. We appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks. And you know what's fun is the book just came out in audiobook form for the first time, just recently, just in the last few weeks. And it's kind of fun. When I read it one way, but it was very interesting to hear a professional narrator perform the book. And it's the closest you'll ever come as an author to hearing how a reader reads it in their head, which is not the same as how you wrote it, right? You have your own intonation and way of saying things. And it was such a fun experience. I had to sit and listen for 12 hours to make sure it was all correct and there were no errors in the book. And it actually made me feel really proud. For the first time, I actually went like, wow, even when you read it differently than I do, it's still actually an okay, good book. And so that was actually a lot of fun to hear the narrator. She did a lovely job performing the voices, and she actually does it. She performs it versus reads it.
And what did you find was different from the way you heard it in your head when you were writing? What did you hear her do differently?
Some of just the intonation. You know, part of it is I'm Scottish. And so I think the way I put intonation on words and sentences is perhaps different than American would. And so some of the intonation and where she kind of emphasized the words and which word in a sentence and the beginning versus the end of the word. She did a fabulous job of getting the emotions right. So all the emotions were correct. It wasn't like she read a line and I was like, no, that wasn't supposed to be read that way. It was quite the opposite. It was getting the emotion across, but just with a different intonation than I would. I mean, as I wrote the book, one of the things I'd do is I would have the computer read it to me. And it's interesting because computers read with a horrible voice, right? I would have Scrivener read it to me and it's a computerized voice. But what it does is it forces you to focus on whether the sentences are actually working, because it takes away the correction that you do in your head as an author. You just kind of overcorrect. So when you have a computer read it, if it doesn't sound good, you can't avoid the fact that it doesn't sound right and you have to go fix it. So that's one of the tips I actually give writers is not only read your own work, but have it read to you by a computer or anyone. I mean, you could have a person do it, but it's hard. But that really helps make sure the rhythm of the sentences is working.
What excellent advice. Thank you again. So thanks again for joining us, Lainey. What a pleasure.
Thank you. This has been so fun.
Thanks for joining us. Look for more episodes of All Right in Sin City wherever you listen to podcasts, or check out our website, allrightinsincity.com. For information and announcements of new podcasts, sign up to our email list or follow us on Facebook and Twitter.